Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special Creative Sensemaker Live in association with Santander, to whom many thanks. As you may know, we about once a month we do a Sensemaker Live that's devoted to the Creative Sensemaker theme that comes out on a Thursday, the email newsletter we publish on culture and books. And today we're looking at the whole question of the future of the book industry, and it's very nice in these rather demanding and tough times to be looking at a good news story, which is the whole question about whether the resilience and success of the printed book is here to stay, and what it means and what it tells us and what we can do to get books to more people. I'm Matt Dancona. I'm an editor and a partner at Tortoise, and I suppose I have a very personal interest in this because I'm completely, as you might see from behind me, I'm obsessed with books, physical books. I can't work out why, because I've made a more or less complete move over to digital music, having grown up with vinyl. I still have the occasional expensive relapse into vinyl, but I'm basically digital when it comes to tunes, and I rarely handle a print version of anything I write as a journalist. But for books, I still have a kind of very deep-seated affection, and I can't see a time arising where I don't buy them, which is odd because they're not easy to carry around. They take up huge amounts of space at home, but we do seem to have a very robust affection for them as artifacts, as items. So that's really the kind of the mystery at the heart of today's thinking that we're trying to unravel. And we've got two fantastic speakers, and of course we want you all to join in and tell us what you think about this issue and why it is that we are so we're so attached to the book. I want to start, if I may, turn to Valerie Brandis, who we're very lucky to have here. She's the founder of the award-winning independent publishing house Jacaranda Books, and a warm welcome to you, Valerie. I suppose if I mean, just to let's dive in, and I wanted to ask why you thought the printed book has survived, because I checked this morning, and ebooks have been around since 1971, admittedly before the internet. So, it was only when the Kindle came around in 2007, and then Apple Books a few years later. Audible goes all the way back to 1995. But as we saw in those slides at the beginning, this is a good time for the printed book. And I just wondered, as a publisher, what you make of that.
Yeah, I think it's one of those questions, isn't it, that sort of functions on so many different levels and is very multi-layered. So, from, I guess, a physiological perspective, there are all these studies that have been done on the importance of like paper and like that tactile relationship that we have with paper that draws people to books. But I know that as a publisher, that's not necessarily at the forefront of what we're doing when we're trying to publish books and get them out there. And that sort of question of the industry and the business of books, and that kind of perennial question almost in the publishing world of, will books, is the industry falling apart? Is it failing? And, we sort of have this kind of happen every few years. And we also have this answer, oh, books are making a comeback every few years. And it's just kind of, it's a difficult one. I think it operates on very many levels. I think people are attracted to physical books and they're attracted to the feel of paper. And I think that it's the industry's job to provide as many interesting and as many, kind of entertaining reads as they possibly can. And I think that where the technological world will be taking us, we've seen many great strides in audiobooks, which have overtaken that kind of pull that we thought the ebook would have. It's definitely happening in audiobooks, but still people want that print book. And I think that people thing is a human thing. It's just, it's the way that we are as human beings. And for me, I do think the book is highly portable, and I will sit in a bathtub and read a book, and I will stick it in my bag and, or use it to prop open the door. And I've lost count of the amount of times when I've tried to read on my iPad and fallen asleep and nearly got stitches in my forehead. So there is some value in that actual book as well,
And you know, when you founded Jacaranda, did you think that you would now, roundabout now, be dealing with a world where the printed book was still as, you know, robustly successful as it is?
I think it's such a great question, because when I think about that, I don't think anyone that I know of, when it comes to publishing, and certainly not myself, think about the business of publishing. Like, it's one of those things where you just sort of assume they'll always be there. You know, it's just this part of, especially, I think almost uniquely, British culture, that, you know, our love affair with writers and fiction in particular, and reading and books, it's, you know, it's just part of who we are and what we do. So when I thought about setting up Jacaranda, it was in terms of what had gone before me, in terms of other Black publishers, you know, like Rosemary Hudson, Verna Wilkins, obviously Margaret Busby, all these amazing women who started publishing houses in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, within the confines of the British publishing, you know, industry, which obviously, you know, has been around for centuries. So it was almost like a given, you know, that they, in the sense that there was somewhere for me to go. And there was also within that somewhere for me to go a need, obviously, that I felt needed to be filled. So that was more kind of prevalent in my mind, that you know, I felt there was an opportunity and a need that needed to be filled, rather than is there going to be an industry?
What was that need, Barry? What was the need that you were trying to fulfill?
Yeah. So yeah, and it's become something that's sort of even beyond any sort of aspiration that I might have had as a sort of person that just wanted to have a business. It's just this idea of who we are as Black Britons, our presence in this country, and within lots of aspects of culture in this country, and understanding that, you know, especially at the time when I lived in America for a very long time, got married and had children there, and then came back to the UK, although I was born here in Hackney, grew up here. But when I came back, you know, there was I got a job in publishing, and there was a lot of conversation about, you know, the lack of diversity, and we had seen all those statistics of the very small numbers of Black writers who've been published. So, and I was also longing for what had happened in the 80s with Virago and Women's Press, when those brilliant editors and those women that founded those two imprints or businesses sought out quote unquote diverse voices. And so I was able here in the UK to read, you know, all these amazing, at the time, African-American writers, people like Toni Morrison, Toni Cade Bambara, Alice Walker, all of these amazing women. And I just thought, well, you know, if that could happen then, I could try and reproduce that somehow. But the sort of impetus also was, as a Black Brit, wanting to see more Black British writers as well, just as a matter of course. So that was the sort of starting point of it. But once we got going, then, you know, sort of everything sort of rushes towards you. You know, you realize the need is actually way far in excess of anything we could have even thought of, you know, which brings us to where we are today and the kind of books we're publishing.
I mean, one of the big, you know, from horrific origins, but then into this extraordinary upsurge, the biggest stories in literature and culture last year was, you know, it captured by that moment when, I remember it well, when René Lodge and Bernardine Evaristo were top of their respective charts. And I mean, it captured a moment, but do you think it was just a moment, or is it something, is that sort of that moment of recognition, was it something that will endure, or was it just a fragile start?
I think we have to be really careful in this media age that we're living in, where we have access to not only see things, but to be seen as well. And I think that can be a really quick shortcut to success for a lot of things that might not necessarily have the legs, or might not necessarily go in the direction that we would want them to go into. I think if you just look at somebody like Bernardine Evaristo has been writing for decades, I mean, at least 2 decades. And all of her books are brilliant, you know, as brilliant, if not some of them more brilliant than the one that ended up winning the Booker with Margaret Atwood. So yes, that did the moment with George Floyd influence people and make them change their minds about how they saw the need for change and how they maybe even saw Black people or Blackness for the first time? Absolutely, clearly it did. Ourselves at Jacaranda, we, you know, at the beginning of last year, you know, with the pandemic, we were in a really tough situation. And in concert with Nights Of, we did a crowdfunder. We did a campaign to raise funds in order to just keep ourselves in business. And, you know, we were about £10,000 the first weekend. And in the following week, the George Floyd murder happened. And by the end of that week, we were over £100,000. So there was a definite, people obviously had a need to sort of feel like they had to show some kind of awareness of what was going on, and to feel to be as if they were doing something. But, you know, the question would be today then, so if you did that, you know, last year, what are you doing today?
What will you be doing on the anniversary, the first anniversary?
Yeah, or which for Black people is, you don't wait for yearly anniversaries, you know, it's every single day.
Yes.
A discussion, a navigation, a question, a resistance, you know, on a daily basis. And also there are differences, there are nuances between what we're experiencing here as Black Britons versus what they're experiencing in America, which has, you know, centuries aged, embedded nonsense, you know. So there's lots of ways, it's really nuanced, I think.
Well, I hope we'll return to that question later in thinking, because it's I think central to the whole story we're talking about. Okay, thank you, Valerie. Can I turn out to Martin Latham, who's you know, one of the most experienced booksellers in the country. Has been running Canterbury Waterstones since 1990. So congratulations on that, Martin. What do you? I mean, you know, as someone who is on the selling side of the equation, what do you agree that it's the physicality, the love of having an artifact, maybe something to share?
Yeah,
what is it?
It's a lot of that. I was thinking the other day, if your friend's aunt has died, you would never send them a Snapchat with a sort of emoji of a coffin and a sad face. You would never write a love letter digitally, or I wouldn't hold out much hope for the marriage if you did, or a bereavement letter. There's something about physical paper, first of all. And I've seen it because I stay on the till in my job. I don't like being in the back office. I've seen it since the 80s. This, as you say, it's a mystery ultimately. People hug books, they kiss them, they go in the corner as if they're embarrassed to smell them, to smell down the middle. There's something really weird. And I've asked several people if they do this with other items, like if you're buying a scarf, which you'd think was more sensuous, do you like sniff it? And often, so after people have bought the book, they just kiss it and hug it. And this goes back in history to all sorts of people, famous people doing it. And then somebody said on the chat about a book as a treasure trove. You can put flowers and pressed flowers and money and love notes in books. And I just got a book to rest on, my notebook actually. And it happens to be my signed Brian Blessed. And I don't know if you can see, but he's filled the whole page being Brian Blessed. So Martin, wonderful event. So all that physical stuff. And this morning I was reading my letters of Virginia Woolf, and they're really the inner sort of dark, shy time of her life. And I just saw on the spine, it just says one word in red. It's stamped on the edge there, withdrawn by the library in Sussex. So you get all these little stories in a book, flowers, treasures left, and the physicality means you can give it to someone. It's not just a practical thing though. You said it was a mystery ultimately, and I love the fact that it's a mystery, and customers seem to enjoy telling me that they don't know why. And yeah, the death of the book, as Valerie said, has been repeatedly announced, as has its comeback. And it's a 500-year-old piece of tech. The fact that it survived this long sort of indicates it's got a longevity, because it seems the petrol car's gone. The compact disc, as you said, has gone. What was that all about? It didn't even hold together. But so it works. And I think, although I never wrote this in my book, it's just occurred to me, I think there's something about the fact that when you open a book, it's like opening a little door. There could be something there. I think we just like something that important and something that involved with our subconscious as a story. We like to get our hands in there. You know, it's like making, what's that thing you do with flour where you make, my mum used to do it, pastry. It's dead physical.
I think it's interesting. It seemed it linked something which, as you say, Martin, is immensely private and intimate, but also something that can be extraordinarily social. I mean, both in space and time, because as you say, it can be an heirloom that gets passed down between people who don't necessarily know each other or down a family. But also at the same time, it can be something that you, in a book club or just informally, you can share with friends or people you don't know. So it's both extremely private, but also very opening and social.
Yeah, I think so. Giving books to each other, giving books as gifts is such an important social thing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's fascinating that you're on the till, and I think that's so good. And I want to ask you and to come back to Valerie on what sorts of books in the last year that we've seen this kind of surge. What sorts of books have people been buying? Is there a tilt towards categories? Are there new categories emerging? That's a question to Martin first, and I'll come back to Valerie. I think you're on mute, Martin.
Yeah, that should be okay. It's quite pleasing. I thought of writing a little article called Walking Past Anton Deck, because you may know that distinguished duo have had a book out, and it's one of those celebrity books, and it's probably very good. But that's the sort of book you see in the front of a bookshop, and people are walking past that sort of book, and they're saying, where's your self-help section? Where's your philosophy section? Where's your nature section? They're getting in deep, and I think there's a longer trend of the democratization of culture, where everyone is sort of channeling themselves into different areas of knowledge without necessarily doing an open university degree. So they're getting in deep and getting their stuff, and they're going in for the Reniedo Lodge. They're less interested in the superficial stuff. That's because of the sort of plague we've had. But there's a longer trend of cynicism, which maybe goes back to things like, you know, the dodgy dossier, the expenses scandal. I'm not going the big history thing here, but we are definitely more cynical of the people we used to take in unquestioning authority, be they novelists, writers, politicians. You and me, Matt, are old enough to remember the early political broadcasts. It was like a priest's sermon, you know. It's like God. So people are far more autonomous in their knowledge finding. And as somebody said also, more non-fiction, and thank God, more diverse fiction. I mean, I was a sort of Amazon picker when we were doing online deliveries, and it was extraordinary. Just people that we've always promoted, like James Baldwin, suddenly you couldn't keep them on the shelf. Diverse writers like that.
It's really interesting.
And more diverse stuff, more thoughtful, less frippery, and time the publishers woke up and stopped giving ridiculous advances to books that weren't even written by the celebrity. They're written by a ghostwriter, which seems like a bit of a cheat. And you see the poor hard-pressed parents buying them for Christmas for someone who likes this person. They're not going to read some large print piece of crap with a couple of photos in the middle about that celebrity. So I think they should be a bit of a busted flush after this, but I know it would take a while.
Valerie, can I ask you the same question really about what you have observed as a publisher about the kinds of books people were buying last year, and whether there were new categories and what the changing patterns were?
Yeah, so it's twofold for us again. We do have an online bookshop, and we were getting people coming to us asking for, now that they have an understanding of where they might fit, as in terms of being anti-racist, what kind of books can I read that will educate me about being an anti-racist? So lots of books, you know, the big one that they want was Ibrahim X. Kendi's book, and then obviously White Fragility, Renee Ideology's book as well. But also as publishers, what we did last year was our big sort of initiative to publish 20 Black British writers in 2020. That was the sort of ambitious thing, which we did. And so we have had an incredible year, and we published some very commercial works, because what we found in terms of, like, especially the younger Black readers, it's just not seeing yourselves in a situation that doesn't include drugs, guns, crime, you know, death, you know, all of the sort of like heavy sort of realities that have been drummed into your sort of minds as young Black people, especially in this country and elsewhere. And there's just a desperation to just, you know, see yourselves as people that fall in love and, you know, have fantasies and just enjoy life in a different way. So one of our most popular books is a book called Lot by Scholler von Reinhold, which is just, I mean, I hate to sort of do these kind of comparisons, but, you know, it's just one of these kind of very elegant, It just escapes me now. Look, you're sort of classic English literature, really, but written by a queer writer, positioning and focusing on Black people in this very kind of high literary environment. And it's a beautiful book, and we've had such an amazing feedback from readers on that book. We did a whole series of romance titles, which they just can't get enough of, crime, you know, and then we've had 5 non-fiction titles, which just, again, you know, Through the Leper's Gaze by Jambi McGrath has been like huge, but we also did 2 memoirs looking at mixed race identity, and those 2 were really huge as well. So all of the books that we published last year have just been really, like, people have just been anxious almost to get some of these titles, just to sort of see themselves in this context, you know. I think something like Bridgerton is a perfect example of the way in which people are longing to see themselves in other environments other than ones where they're telling you it's not going to end well for you if your skin is Black, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope we can put some links to our own Tortoise bookstore to those particular titles into the chat. But before that, I'd like to come to my colleague Zab Greenwood to go through the slides, just to give us a sense of the data that kind of underpins this discussion. Zab, if you want to, over to you.
Yeah, hi. I think Phoebe should have the slides up. So yeah, we just want to give a kind of data picture of what we've seen in the past year. So when the first lockdown hit, there were definitely initial signs that books could prove fairly resilient. Libraries especially saw a pretty good surge in activity, even though they were forced to close. So loans of ebooks and audiobooks were up around 63% in March compared with the year before, and around 120,000 people joined libraries in the 3 weeks after lockdown began. And you can see here 3 of the kind of biggest jumps across kind of county libraries in Hampshire, Cornwall, and Hertfordshire, seeing huge increases in registration. And then if we go to the next slide, this kind of clear interest in reading and books over the pandemic showed itself in end of year figures. So the book industry had, at least by these figures, a very good year. More than 200 million print books were sold in the UK. That was the first time it had topped 200 million since 2012. And the value of the books sold in the UK last year were at their highest number since 2009. So the top line figures definitely are pretty good for print books in the UK. Then if we go to the third slide, another good thing which we found was that independent bookstores, perhaps surprisingly, were resilient last year. They actually went up a number, 50 new independent bookstores opened last year in the UK, 44 closed, and a lot of independent bookstores joined the Booksellers Association, hence why the membership increased. Independent bookstores have been rising in numbers since around 2013. Before that, they'd been declining. Back in 1995, there were about 1,900 independent bookstores. So we're a lot lower than that number. But even last year, we saw a small increase, and it's actually heading in the right direction in that regard. And then if we go to the fourth slide, this is a sign of how much money you can earn if you really make it. So these are the top 10 biggest writers in terms of sales, and this is the top book sales of as much as £10 million. And even if you get down to the 40th, 50th best-selling authors in the UK, people like Adam Kay, Bill Bryson, Nigella Lawson, the Hairy Bikers, they're still selling about £1.5 million worth of books. So at least at the very top, there's a lot of books still being sold. And then if we go to the final slide, I think this has to be a big caveat against all of that good news, which is for smaller authors, for aspiring authors, for authors who depend on school visits, on lecturing, on performance. It's been difficult. The Society of Authors set up an emergency fund at the start of the pandemic. It raised more than £1 million from that, but it's been, asking for more money throughout because there's been a lot of demand for their resources. And obviously we talked about libraries at the beginning, and libraries had a rise in digital membership and have managed to adapt quite well, but still the fact that they're closed has meant that people are losing some of that kind of discovery of new writers. And in the long term, the outlook for libraries isn't necessarily brilliant. So I'd say it's been a good year for books, but with quite a few caveats in terms of the future. And that's everything.
Thank you very much, Sab. That's really, really interesting, and lots to chew over there. I wanted to come, if I may, to Tanish Saha, if you're there, Tanish, because you had a very interesting point in the chat about the kind of role of analog in our lives.
Yeah.
And I guess I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seemed to me a very interesting point that there's always an assumption that everyone wants to move from analog to digital, but maybe this shows that there are some aspects of our lives where we don't want to make that transition.
Yeah, so I'm a university student, and a lot of my life is revolving around my laptop and my phone, and I really think there are some points that I want to get away from it all. And I follow a lot of YouTubers who've tried to transition to like technology that's analog, like analog cameras and just like going off their smartphones and stuff like that. But I think to us, like as a large number of people, we find the book the most accessible because it doesn't require technical know-how of how shutter speeds, developing the film or something like that works. It's just a story, but it has that tactile factor to it. You can turn the page and you get a certain kind of joy when you finish the book, but then it's also a certain kind of gap that's there because you invested so much time in the book and now it's not going to be a part of your daily schedule. So I think that's really something that pulls me towards a book.
And do you find, Tanish, that it's part that books are very much part of your life as a student, in your learning, or are they a kind of something that you do, outside of the formal learning curriculum?
I think in terms of like physical books, right now it's mostly something that I do for leisure because most of my readings, since we're an online university, they are trying to make an effort to make them all online and we can't really go to the library to access them. But so most of my course readings are online, but when I need a break from the screen, that's when I go to like the books that I'm reading for myself outside my curriculum. So I think that's the respite, the movement away from a screen that really helps me in that sense.
No, I'm sure that makes a lot of sense. I'd love to come, if I may, to my colleague Gabby Sandlo, who has been talking enthusiastically in the chat about the whole business and culture of book clubs, which I'm sure have a part to play in the story. Gabby, are you there? Hi, Gabby.
Hi. Yes, I'm here. Yeah. Well, I was just.
Tell us what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I was just sharing an experience of a book club that I created with some of my close friends, actually. So it was a sort of method for us to get together regularly and have some dinner and chat about a book. And it was great and it all ran really well. But unfortunately, the book that I recommended, which was very close to my heart, which was Therese Racan by Emile Zola, which my mum recommended to me and I absolutely adored, all of my friends hated it. And I was utterly heartbroken because I just felt that I ought to fight to defend it. And there were some really good points. Some of my friends felt that the translation wasn't great, but yeah, that was my experience. And so I've sort of been somewhat put off book clubs, but I do think they are great. And it's such a wonderful way to share your own sort of personal responses and understand how differently people imagine things. I think I'm always interested in the way that people conjure up the characters in their minds so differently based on your own perceptions and your sort of previous expectations.
And you don't think that the book club idea, the kind of communality of it survives into digital land, if you like?
Good question. I haven't had any personal experience of it, but I think the way that we're able to engage with people on this kind of format and in this forum, I don't see why it wouldn't work. I think, you know, if it's well moderated, and I think if everybody has an opportunity to share their thoughts and experiences, and I don't see why it shouldn't work in a virtual forum. But I think it probably does need a bit of sort of chaperoning to make sure that you kind of get the most out of your time spent looking at a screen.
Thanks, Kelly. I wanted to come to Matthew Ennis now, who I think made a very interesting point about the sense of accomplishment you get after finishing a physical book. I don't know if you're there, Matthew.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
So I'm 16 as well, so I think it's particularly, like, for me, being of a younger generation, is like growing up with screens. But I feel like everything we do is like so fast paced and on a screen, and like social media, everything's coming at you like 24/7. So I think when you actually sit down and read a book in full, I know that I like to have like the physical book on my shelf as almost a memento of doing it. And I think I know a lot of other people who have the same experience.
It's very interesting. I mean, do you find that's, I mean, interesting you say that you know lots of people who have that experience. One thing I notice about, I've got two teenage sons, and they, you know, they read a lot, and they read a lot online. And when you know, I don't notice their generation carting boxes full of books around, even though they're well read. But your experience is otherwise.
Yeah, I think it's about, I do a lot of things on my phone and on a screen, and like a lot of things digitally, like music, news, all of those things. And I think the fact that I do so much on a screen, and the fact that my friends, for example, also do everything on us, like even school now is obviously on a screen. I think that for us makes it more important to actually just read a physical book, because it makes it feel like it's not just something that you're doing in like your everyday life, but it feels almost as if you've taken that time out to do it and have got that accomplishment that you don't feel with like other activities. In the same way, I'd like people like read a physical paper, I think.
I think it's interesting because it's like, you know, the phone is very much the sort of the dopamine hit of the post, the like, and what you're describing is a much more, you know, is a much more stretched out, and I guess, you know, having the time and also the space to enjoy something at that length is very special. Can we come to Katie Vanek-Smith, who's the co-founder of Tortoise, because she was talking about being a mum and what it means, and some very interesting thoughts about how that fits into this whole question, Katie.
Hello. I love the fact that I suppose when my son's 10, so he's what they call Generation Alpha, the child that was born after the iPad. So like, you know, all of those toddlers that you first saw where they swipe TVs because everything was sort of digitally iPad driven, that was my son. You know, he used to try and swipe the TV on, you know, that sort of whole phone and screen world. And what I love is that, you know, there are so many things. I think the young man who was just talking before said the same thing, which is his whole life is on a screen, right? Right now, particularly, you know, everything in his life, school, you know, his social life is on a screen right now. The only way he can actually speak to his friends is when he's gaming on one hand and FaceTiming on the other. Everything is screen-based. And so seeing things like books and jigsaw puzzles be something that he physically engages with brings me as much joy as I think it brings him, right? Because these are things that I just assumed, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you know, when you got your Kindle for the first time, or when you got, you know, your apps and you could do all of these things on digital, but they're not things that have just happened in lockdown for me. I think this generation, this Generation Alpha, as they're called, it happened really early on. So even when he was a toddler, if you gave him a physical jigsaw puzzle or the jigsaw puzzle app, he would pick physical over digital. And there are some things that I think it's just really great to see. I think digital book sales plateaued at 35%. That was them at their peak, you know, of the market when, you know, this is when I worked at News, and HarperCollins was saying that, you know, oh, we've peaked at 35% of total book sales. But at one point we thought digital would take away all of these traditionally physical, you know, habits of reading or puzzle making. So my point is just, I think, you know, it is the book's resilience is that, and the jigsaw puzzle resilience, if you like, is that those things are just better in that tangible format. A Kindle's great when you're on a beach in the sun and you're on holiday and you know, you can do all that, but the physical book is so much better than the digital experience. And that, I think, is like, you know, also I love Tortoise like this, but I can't wait till I can get back in a room and hug you all. That's also where I'm going to end, because that is a physical experience I miss every day.
I did want to ask you a follow-up actually, which is, you know, you and I have talked a lot about books, and you were the driving force behind Tortoise Bookstore, but we also talk a lot about access. And I just wonder, how do we, you know, do you see a kind of way of getting physical books into more people's hands? You know, if they are here to stay, which is fantastic. How do we make sure that, you know, it's not just they're not just available to middle class people in the South, and you know, there's a way of spreading this joy. There's a way of spreading this access to you know, wonder and
Giving that to me.
Yeah, I am.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay. So look, one of the things that really struck me again from the HarperCollins data when I worked at News was that that somebody who buys 8 books a year is a heavy book buyer. I mean, like Matt D'Ancona, your bookshelf behind you means that you've got a bad habit or you've got a very good habit, right? There's sort of 8 books a year is a heavy book buyer. I mean, I buy 8 books in one go when I walk into a shop, you know, so there definitely is the sense that, you know, there is a skew, I think, in book buying. How do you make them available to everybody? I mean, there are some things that I really love, like libraries. Every child loves a library. I mean, kids love being in libraries. And I think there is more that we need to do to, you know, support our libraries and keep them open. So that data that Zav showed at the beginning, I think is amazing. You know, that's a positive from lockdown, even if they were digitally using them. But the library as a destination is also something we should think about, and how those libraries can be centers of communities for people. But I love in my village, there's Mary. Mary's 80. I can see Nancy, who also lives in my village, is on this call. So that's sort of, we live in a very nice village. But Mary, who lives in our village, puts a wheelbarrow outside her house and puts in lots of physical books and you know, just to pass them on. Yeah. And I noticed that there's more places in New Zealand. I think this started in New Zealand, where people created their own little book shelves outside where people could open up and just help themselves to books. And that's something that I think is popping up in more and more places for people to sort of pass it on and share it on. But yeah, I mean, and ultimately, you know, schools having libraries is really important. So I don't know, there's a lot of books that go to pulp every year, right? So one of the data points I would love to understand, and I think we could do more with, is how many books that get published end up getting pulped because they don't sell, and what do you do with those? So I don't know whether there's something more we could be doing with those books that end up being recycled and pulped, where you could actually do something more generous with them.
I couldn't agree more. It's thank you so much, Katie. Can I come to Ella Devro now, who was talking again, going back to book clubs, very interestingly in the chat. Hi Ella, how are you?
Hello. Yes. No, I was just saying that I'm part of a LGBT book club which my friend from home set up, and we have been like looking at books every month, but it's really no pressure. Like if you don't read them, it doesn't matter. And then we've been doing these Zoom coffee mornings, and it's just been really nice. And instead of I mean, obviously we have a coffee, but what we do is the money that we would spend on going to a coffee shop, we donate to the Norfolk LGBT project. So it's sort of like a little fundraising thing. But yeah, it's just a really like safe space to just talk about the books that we've been reading, which are all sort of LGBT books, but also just to get to know each other. It's a nice thing to have in this sort of weird time.
It's fascinating that, because it sort of it's that example again of how books, though they are sort of very private and personal, can also be fabulous connectors, can't they?
Yeah, no, honestly, I think that's what it is. And because we all have this sort of shared thing, I think it's really important, because a lot of the, what am I trying to say? A lot of the things that I would do with like my friends that are also LGBT, I'm not able to do. So I think it's really important to have this sort of like unity in communities like that.
No, absolutely. And would you say that the book club has been, a real help during lockdown?
Yeah, like 100%. I think I've missed being able to sort of talk with my friends that sort of belong to the LGBT community. So it has been really helpful and comforting as well. It's been really nice.
No, sure. I'd like to thank you so much, Ella. I'd like to come back to Martin and Valerie about this whole question of access in various ways. Martin, are you at the store? Do you notice, or did you before? I suppose I should say before lockdown. Is it basically a small group of people buying more books, or is there a greater spread, or how is it working?
I think it's getting better. I think when bookshops and publishers come out of this crisis, they're going to need to really raise their game. No more boring bookshops, and I know a lot of chain bookstores are boring with mechanical customer service. They're going to have to do events. I mean, we did an event with Michael Fuller, who was the first Black Met commissioner. He'd written a book, and we had 250 people crammed in the store, and it wasn't a typical demographic. Lots of younger people, and we all know that places like literary festivals aren't very welcoming spaces. I mean, I have to confess, when I was young, I didn't think I was allowed in Hatchard's Piccadilly. I parked my bike, and it just seemed like an exclusive shop, the Queen shop. I look back on that with wonder now. Hatchard's is owned by Waterstones anyway. It's just another bookshop. So, and we know that publishers aren't very diverse. The demographic has changed, which is fantastic. And I think things like author talks will help that. Because the thing I wanted to say about books, and what Matthew Ennis said was, when do we ever just do one thing? Even when we're on the Kindle, we see messages come up. We're cooking, we've probably got the radio, we're talking. And there's that recent book, The Shallows, about what digital is doing to us, scrambling our brains. Not too pessimistic, because we need our brains to be multifaceted, because we're hunter-gatherers and all that stuff. But when do we ever do one thing? I mean, when I meditate, I have a notebook, and I'm crap at meditation. I keep writing things down, checking my phone. Whereas when you read, you can actually forget yourself. Sometimes you forget the chair. You even forget where you are. So that's why it's unique to everyone. But bookshops don't represent that complete openness to society that you get in a clothes shop, for instance. There's still a bit exclusive. But to answer your question at the beginning, yeah, it's changing fast. Bookshops are becoming much more inclusive. They're not just one old bloke in a tweed jacket at the back growling at you when you come in.
Which is good news. But Valerie, can I sort of throw that question your way too, which is, what, I mean, we've covered various things, but I don't think one can talk about this enough, and the whole question of the information economy and access to books, that it's fantastic that there's a more there's a growing awareness, at least, of the need for more diverse authorship and publishing, but we really want to get books into as many hands as we can, and they are expensive. There are lots. So what is the answer? More resources for libraries? Is the answer more voluntary schemes? And what do you think in those terms?
I mean, I know for me, growing up in Hackney as a young child, if I didn't have access to the local library, I don't know what I would have done in terms of trying to find books. Knowing that the idea of a publishing world or even a book buying world was just not something that was natural to me growing up at all. But going to the library all day long, and that whole thing we just talked about of going in there and sticking your face in a book and you smell that sort of sugar smell, and we have the same experience. It's no different. In terms of access overall, I think where I see things are changing is that people, especially in the Black and brown communities, are just wanting to do things more for themselves. And so, you know, it's up to the whole of the communities to come along, and it's therefore up to you to educate yourselves, to seek out new works, and to really put yourself in a position to be open to, you know, different ways of looking at the world. No one's going to come along and tell you, this is my way of looking at the world, would you like it? It's not that. That's not happening anymore. It's, we know what we want. We know what we're seeking out, what we're looking for in books, what we're looking for our writers. I know from my experience at Jacaranda, we hosted our first Black British Festival at the end of the last year, which was amazing. We know there's a huge readership out there. We know there's a huge market out there. And, you know, for the woman that talked about her book club and bringing this book that nobody liked, in a way, I love that. You know, that's really important. You're not going to like everything. You just aren't. It doesn't make it better or worse. It just is what it is. And that's all part of the beauty of what we're doing, isn't it? It's not one size, one taste fits all.
It seems, I've always, you know, believed that books in the end are liberating and empowering. I worry sometimes that the obsession with set texts and examinations has turned them into objects of kind of slightly radioactive for a lot of kids, and persuading them that they're not just things you study for a tick box test at the end of the year or not in pandemic times. And I just wonder, Valerie, how you see that. How do you persuade kids that books are, you know, they are ways of developing your humanity and your agency?
Well, I do think that set texts actually are important, because for a lot of kids, that's the first and only place that they will have any interaction with a book. So I do think it's important that we do have that moment in school for a lot of children. Not to keep banging on about Jacaranda, but one of the books we published last year was a book by a young Black guy. It's called Ugly Dogs Don't Cry. And it is a modern rewriting of Mice and Men. And Of Mice and Men is the set text for, it's in every single school in this country. At a certain grade level, I'm not sure which level it is, but everyone reads that book. And it doesn't have really, it's a brilliant, beautiful book. But what Didi did with his book was just try and make it a bit more relevant to where we are. So it's set around Northwest London. And it's using that sort of landscape rather than the American landscape. So I don't think the answer therefore is to take books out of school in any way. You know, even the boring books matter. You know, I think it's really important because that's what encourages an awareness of words and literature anyway. That's what it did for me. But it is about trying to understand, you know, how we can then create something more sort of rich and something more open within that context. So that, you know, I can say I had to read Evelyn Waugh. Would I pick up an Evelyn Waugh book naturally on my own today? Probably not. But I did enjoy them when I was reading them. And I can say that I did read them amongst many other books, you know, and that helped me become a good reader. So
absolutely. Well, it's that wonderful Toni Morrison quote about there being many canons and the more the better, I guess. I just want to come to Fia, if I may, who had just this wonderful example of how to redistribute books. If you're there, Fia. Oh, I think she's having trouble with audio. Let's go to Alison then. Alison, I know you had a point you wanted to make. Alison. Are you there?
Yes, sorry, I am, and I need the video on as well. Hang on, right. Okay. It was now. Can you hear me? Sorry about that.
Yep, we can hear you. We can see you.
Good.
Welcome.
Well, it was actually about book clubs, because in my particular book group, we have people who access the book of the month in different ways. So we've got a couple of people who always do ebooks. I always do a print book, and someone who always does audiobooks, and he always accesses them that way. And what's interesting is how different the experience sometimes can be when we're having the discussion. And I think that's something we haven't thought about as well, is it's a kind of privacy, this private world that you enter in a book. that in a print book that is something that's really important, and it's kind of come up in different ways, hasn't it? But I think that's another of the attractions of the print book. Somehow when you're holding an ebook, it doesn't have that same sense of you're entering a world. And I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I think all of them have a place. That's the thing, for each of us has chosen in our group to access a book that way because it fits with their lives. And I think we're really lucky now to have that kind of multifarious, different kind of avenues into reading.
No, I absolutely true. Thank you very much, Alison. I want to come to my colleague Francis Andrew, who's making a point about. Well, I'll let him make it because it's a specific one, but it's an interesting one.
Which point was that?
The scoop point.
Oh, scoop. Yeah. So it's been lying around for ages. I read it ages and ages and ages ago, and I read it again about 2 weeks ago, and it's witty, like it's wittily written. I have absolutely no idea like how you would do an adaptation of it or anything like that now. It's aged very badly. The language in it is, I mean, I found myself kind of pulling faces when I was reading it and having a physical reaction to it. It made me very uncomfortable, but it's a shame, I guess, because yeah, it's very much a relic of the past. Yeah.
Did you read it when you were younger with a different attitude?
Yeah, I kind of read it in this really pretentious phase in my early 20s when I decided I had to sort of try and improve myself because I wasn't a big reader at school. So I kind of went in and bought loads and loads of novels that had sort of important looking covers and that I'd heard of. And you know, when they put like a table in foils or Waterstones of like classics, and I would just pick a couple up and work my way through them or give up a sort of a third of the way in. Like Liz has just mentioned. So yeah, and Scoop is the one that sort of stuck with me because I remember finding it quite funny. And at the time when I first read it, I didn't really pay attention to like the whole like the way it talked about race. And yeah, it was just a little bit of a revelation.
It's very odd rereading books, I think, because I mean the classic war one on that I think is Brideshead, which you know when it had its great moment with the TV series in the 80s was seen very much as a book about, you know, being a student and being young and in love. And actually, when you reread it, it's a book about the Second World War, and it's a totally different, it's a totally different thing. And it's about the way he thought that the war was going to change society, and he didn't. I wondered if we could come to C.D. Piggott, who had a very interesting point about how we can kind of mobilize social media to encourage interest in print books. C.D., I don't know if you're there. Hi, Sidi. Hi, welcome.
God, I've got sun in my eyes.
Yes, very bright. Lovely, sunny.
Yeah, well, I was just saying that I'd noticed that the author David Nichols, who I really like and sort of interact with quite a lot, he feels that all these people who've had books coming out, you know, for the past year are missing out on not having their cheap wine and soggy crisp parties, and so he does these regular kind of little launches for them, which I really love. And well, and also, I mean, there are lots and lots of author kind of talks, you know, that I've been to. I mean, you know, just through lots of different places, apart from the bookshops, but like, you know, King's Place, and there's the Jewish Book Week coming up soon as well, which always has, you'll be so amazed how many authors are Jewish.
Well, I'm not, but I love Jewish Book Week, and I always go. And
You've taken part in it, haven't you?
Yeah, no, I've taken part in it several years in a row. It's one of my favorites. Thank you very much, Sidi. I'd like to, we're running out of time, sadly, but I'd love to bring in my colleague Liz Mosley, who has made a number of fab points in the chat. But just one I wanted to ask about, Liz, which is the whole question of self-selection.
Oh, good.
Really interesting, which is that when book people get together, you compare them to cat people, which is, you know, quite close to the bone, but it's also, but I think it's a very good point. And I wonder how we could kind of get out of that.
I was worried you were going to ask me to tell the story of when I was kicked out of the book club for being insufferable, but luckily we won't have time for that. Yeah, I don't know. I do. I suppose I've loved this hour. I've loved it. it just feels like a treat and an indulgence, and it makes me want to go and wander and browse and do all the things that we've talked about. But I'm really conscious that I just feel lucky to be somebody that books managed to get me when I was probably 16 or 17. I wasn't a big sort of kid reader at all, and there weren't lots of books in my house when I was growing up, but one way or another I read Doris Lessing, really caught my imagination, and then I quickly sort of ended up doing Updike's all in a row, and then I was away then, you know. But I kind of feel like there is something, we've talked about nostalgia and we've talked about comfort and we've talked about connection and all of these things, but I think if you don't get into it, then I worry that there's a sort of slight superiority. There's a sort of, we have to be sort of mindful of, oh, we're all the book people, and there's all those people over there that maybe they dip into a gold covered crime novel that they've bought at W.H. Smith's at Stansted Airport. Do you know what I mean? I worry there's a whiff of that a little bit. Not that I don't indulge myself in that, absolutely.
Will do. No, but I think it's absolutely right. One must be always mindful of keeping, you know, of making sure that it's not a stockade, the book club, that it's, you know, it's got open borders and we're always bringing people in, and it's so important. I think it's very important to citizenship, and also just to the enjoyment of a good life, to have access to lots of books. And I'm sort of so thrilled that the printed book is still running, and you know, it's an inspiration to hear people like Valerie and Martin talk about, you know, the continued success of the industry. And you know, what one wants is for libraries to be much better resourced, and for all the schemes that, you know, that exist to perhaps be more systematic, so that we can extend this to everyone, and that every child can have a chance to learn and to go through that kind of rite of passage that Liz described just now. Sadly, we're coming to the end of the hour. I would like to really thank Valerie and Martin very warmly for making this possible, with their fantastic contributions, and wish them both well in their respective enterprises. Thanks Santander as well. I think we've kind of established that, you know, there's a kind of fascinating link in the physical book between the private and the social, and that can mean a lot, both in broad social terms, but also in terms of you know, the groups that we're part of, the communities that we're part of, and that there is something particularly strong and magical and gravitational about the physical book, but that there remains that whole issue of access and making sure that people are able to get books, and looking forward at ways to do that. And I'm sure it's a subject to which we'll return. The Creative Sensemaker comes out every Thursday. If you take a trial membership, Tortoise, you'll get it automatically. So do please do that. Meanwhile, only remains for me to thank you all, wish you a fantastic afternoon, and see you all very soon. Thanks for now.